I have spent decades watching people walk into my courtroom. Most walk in with nervous anticipation. Some walk in with genuine fear, hoping for a fair outcome. But every now and then, someone walks through those heavy wooden doors, acting as if they own the building, the gavel, and the judge holding it. They carry a very specific kind of energy. It isn't confidence, it is entitlement. And I still remember the morning a 21-year-old named Preston Sterling walked into my courtroom wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people earn in a month, smirking at the court officer, and treating the entire judicial process like a minor inconvenience. He walked into my courtroom like he didn't belong there, like this was all a mistake that would be corrected. He believed his name would protect him, and he believed power would carry him out the same door he walked in. What he did not know was that a courtroom is the great equalizer. In here, your bank account cannot cross-examine a witness. Believe me, the moment reality finally pierced his bubble of absolute privilege, what happened next was something I had never seen in 40 years on the bench. The plaintiff was a man named David Miller. He was 55 years old, an elderly veteran, and an independent mechanic. His hands were calloused, his posture tired but straight, and his demeanor incredibly respectful. He stood quietly, holding a meticulously organized manila folder containing his evidence. Across the aisle stood Preston Sterling. He didn't bring a folder. He brought an attitude of absolute, unfiltered boredom. From the moment he entered, it was clear he believed he would walk free, protected by his name and his connections. Years on the bench teach you that people who respect the law prepare for it. People who believe they are above the law simply show up, expecting the world to bend to their will. Preston leaned heavily against his podium, checking his expensive gold watch, sighing loudly enough for the entire gallery to hear. Interesting, very interesting, because that kind of theatrical sigh usually masks a profound lack of substance. People trying to appear untouchable often overcompensate. The dispute itself appeared remarkably straightforward on paper. David Miller claimed that Preston had recklessly crashed his brand-new luxury sports car into David's vintage, restored pickup truck, a truck David had spent 4 painful years rebuilding by hand. The collision completely totaled the truck. The unpaid damages amounted to $28,000. David claimed Preston promised to pay at the scene, then later laughed in his face, threw a $100 bill at his feet, and sped off. Preston claimed the accident was entirely David's fault. At least, that was the official story he intended to sell me today. He stood there, practically daring me to hold him accountable, fully expecting his father's shadow to cover his tracks. He stood there, practically daring me to hold him accountable, fully expecting his father's shadow to cover his tracks. But his highly paid lawyers weren't here to speak for him. This was my courtroom, and in my courtroom, you stand on your own 2 feet. I asked Mr. Miller to explain his side of the story. He detailed how he was legally parked at a red light when Preston's car slammed into him at nearly 60 miles per hour. He presented the police report. He presented the photographs of his destroyed truck. He presented the repair estimates. It was thorough. It was factual. Preston interrupted him. Your Honor, that truck was a piece of junk anyway. The courtroom fell dead silent. Mr. Miller didn't react. He just slowly shook his head. I stared at Preston. Interesting. Very interesting. Because people who are genuinely innocent rarely feel the need to insult the victim's property. That kind of arrogance usually comes from someone who knows they are guilty but believes they won't face consequences. I asked Preston for his version of events. He smirked, leaned into the microphone and said, Look, I was barely moving. The guy stopped suddenly for no reason. And honestly, my car sustained more damage than that rusted-out antique. Interesting defense. Not compelling, but interesting. I asked him, Mr. Sterling, the police report indicates you were traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. Does that sound like barely moving to you? He waved his hand dismissively. Cops exaggerate. Besides, my dad's insurance can cover a few dents. This whole thing is a waste of my time. The sheer level of entitlement was staggering. He wasn't defending himself with facts. He was defending himself with his father's bank account. He viewed the entire judicial system as an inconvenience, a minor speed bump in his otherwise perfect life. I looked at the young man, then at the police report, and then back at him. Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, this is not a negotiation. You do not get to dictate the value of someone else's property or the severity of your own reckless behavior. He rolled his eyes. Whatever. Just tell me how much I have to write the check for so I can leave. That caught my attention immediately. People usually fight tooth and nail to avoid paying judgments. Preston was offering to pay just to escape the lecture. He thought money could buy his way out of accountability, but money doesn't buy character, and it certainly doesn't buy respect in my courtroom. Then, Mr. Miller presented something unexpected, a collection of text messages exchanged between him and Preston immediately after the accident. I reviewed them carefully. "Did you send these messages?" I asked Preston. He glanced at them briefly, completely unbothered. "Yeah. So?" I began reading them aloud for the record. Message 1. "Stop calling me, old man." Message 2. "My dad will bury you in legal fees if you try to sue." Message 3. "That truck belonged in a junkyard anyway. Consider this a favor." The courtroom became completely silent. The spectators exchanged shocked looks. Even the court officer stood a little straighter, because there it was, documented proof of his utter contempt for the damage he had caused. It wasn't just negligence, it was malicious arrogance. I looked directly at Preston. "You consider destroying 4 years of this man's hard work a favor?" For a split second, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, just a flicker. But the smirk quickly returned. "It's just a truck." "It's not just a truck, Mr. Sterling," I replied. "It is property, it is value, and it is something you destroyed." Then, the case took a turn that nobody, especially Preston, saw coming. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and an older man walked in. He was impeccably dressed, carrying himself with quiet authority. It was Richard Sterling, Preston's father. Preston immediately puffed out his chest, clearly believing his savior had arrived. He looked at Mr. Miller with a triumphant grin. But I noticed something interesting, very interesting. Richard Sterling didn't look at his son. He didn't look at Mr. Miller. He looked directly at me. He approached the railing. "Your Honor, may I approach?" "You may," I said. He handed a document to the bailiff, who handed it to me. I reviewed it carefully, then again, then a third time, because what I was reading fundamentally changed everything. "Mr. Sterling," I said, looking at the father, "are you aware of the contents of this document?" "I am, Your Honor," he replied, his voice firm but laced with something I rarely hear in these situations, deep disappointment. "I drafted it." I looked at Preston. The smirk had completely vanished. He suddenly looked very small, very uncertain, and very afraid, because the document I held was not a defense, it was not a settlement offer. It was a formal declaration from Richard Sterling, stating that he was withdrawing all financial support for his son's legal defense and refusing to cover any damages resulting from this specific incident. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Preston stared at his father, his mouth slightly open. "Dad, what are you doing?" Richard finally turned to look at his son. "I am doing what I should have done years ago, Preston. I am letting you face the consequences of your own actions." That moment was extraordinary. Years on the bench teach you that parents usually protect their children, even when they are wrong. They shield them, they make excuses for them, they try to buy their way out of trouble. But Richard Sterling had reached his limit. He realized that protecting his son from consequences was only enabling his arrogance. I looked at Preston. The confidence was gone. The entitlement was gone. He was no longer the untouchable heir. He was just a 21-year-old kid facing a $28,000 judgment with no way to pay it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Your Honor," Richard continued, turning back to me, "I apologize for my son's behavior. Mr. Miller deserves to be fully compensated, but that compensation will not come from me. Preston will have to find a way to pay it himself." I entered judgment in favor of David Miller for the full $28,000. But the real justice wasn't in the monetary award. The real justice was watching Preston Sterling realize that his name could not save him. His father could not save him. His money could not save him. As the judgment was read, Preston broke down. Actual tears. Not tears of remorse, but tears of pure, unadulterated panic. The shield of privilege had shattered, leaving him entirely exposed to the real world. As they left the courtroom, Richard stopped by Mr. Miller's table and quietly shook his hand. It was a gesture of respect, a silent acknowledgement of the pain his son had caused. Preston walked out behind him, his head bowed, his expensive suit suddenly looking very cheap. Some cases stay with you because of the legal complexity. This case stayed with me because it revealed a profound truth. Power and privilege can protect you from many things, but they cannot protect you from the consequences of your own character. Preston thought he was untouchable. He learned, in the most painful way possible, that in a court of law, everyone is eventually required to answer for themselves. Interesting defense. Not compelling, but interesting, I told Preston, after his arrogant dismissal of the crash. He stood there, practically vibrating with unearned confidence, entirely convinced that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. He claimed David had stopped suddenly for no reason, attempting to frame the victim as a reckless driver trying to extort a wealthy family. But years on the bench teach you that truth doesn't need to shout. Lies, on the other hand, often wear expensive suits and speak very loudly. I turned my attention back to David Miller. The mechanic hadn't raised his voice once. He simply opened his manila folder and carefully pulled out a small black USB drive. He placed it on the podium with a quiet dignity. "Your Honor," David said, his voice steady, "I have dashcam footage from a vehicle traveling in the opposite direction. The driver stopped and provided it to the police at the scene." I looked at Preston. For the first time since he swaggered through the courtroom doors, his posture stiffened. The smirk didn't completely vanish, but it certainly cracked. People who lie confidently usually rely on the absence of objective truth. When objective truth suddenly appears in the form of a digital recording, their entire strategy relies on improvisation. And Preston was not nearly as clever as he believed he was. I accepted the drive and instructed the bailiff to play the footage on the courtroom monitors. The screen flickered to life, showing a clear, high-definition view of the intersection. We watched as David's meticulously restored vintage pickup sat completely stationary at a solid red light. There was no sudden stop. There was no erratic behavior. He was simply waiting for the light to change. Then, entering the frame at a terrifying speed, was Preston's luxury sports car. It didn't even attempt to brake until a fraction of a second before impact. The collision was violent, shattering the rear of David's truck and pushing it halfway through the intersection. The courtroom echoed with the recorded sound of crushing metal and breaking glass. I paused the video right at the moment of impact and looked directly at Preston. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly very interested in the polished wood of his podium. "Mr. Sterling," I said, breaking the silence, "would you like to revise your statement about the plaintiff stopping suddenly for no reason?" Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his tie in a sudden display of nervous energy. "Well, from my perspective behind the wheel, it looked different, and regardless, the brakes on my car are highly sensitive. It was a mechanical malfunction. I shouldn't be held liable for a defective vehicle." Interesting, very interesting, because now we were pivoting from blaming the victim to blaming the manufacturer. It is a common tactic among those who refuse to take accountability. If you can't blame the person you hit, blame the machine you were driving. But just like his first excuse, this one was about to collapse under the weight of actual evidence. "A mechanical malfunction," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "Is that your official legal position today, Mr. Sterling?" "Yes," he stated, regaining a fraction of his false bravado. "My father's legal team is already looking into a lawsuit against the dealership, so technically this isn't my fault." I nodded, then turned back to David's folder. Because David, unlike Preston, hadn't just brought a video. He had brought the entire police investigation report, which included the on-scene forensic analysis of Preston's vehicle. I flipped to the 4th page and found exactly what I was looking for. The truth was about to make Preston Sterling very, very uncomfortable. I accepted the drive and instructed the bailiff to play the footage on the courtroom monitors. The screen flickered to life, showing a clear, high-definition view of the intersection. We watched as David's meticulously restored vintage pickup sat completely stationary at a solid red light. There was no sudden stop. There was no erratic behavior. He was simply waiting for the light to change. Then, entering the frame at a terrifying speed, was Preston's luxury sports car. It didn't even attempt to brake until a fraction of a second before impact. The collision was violent, shattering the rear of David's truck and pushing it halfway through the intersection. The courtroom echoed with the recorded sound of crushing metal and breaking glass. I paused the video right at the moment of impact and looked directly at Preston. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly very interested in the polished wood of his podium. "Mr. Sterling," I said, breaking the silence, "would you like to revise your statement about the plaintiff stopping suddenly for no reason?" Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his tie in a sudden display of nervous energy. "Well, from my perspective behind the wheel, it looked different. And regardless, the brakes on my car are highly sensitive. It was a mechanical malfunction. I shouldn't be held liable for a defective vehicle." Interesting, Very interesting. Because now we were pivoting from blaming the victim to blaming the manufacturer. It is a common tactic among those who refuse to take accountability. If you can't blame the person you hit, blame the machine you were driving. But just like his first excuse, this one was about to collapse under the weight of actual evidence. A mechanical malfunction, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Is that your official legal position today, Mr. Sterling? Yes, he stated, regaining a fraction of his false bravado. My father's legal team is already looking into a lawsuit against the dealership, so, technically, this isn't my fault. I nodded, then turned back to David's folder. Because David, unlike Preston, hadn't just brought a video. He had brought the entire police investigation report, which included the on-scene forensic analysis of Preston's vehicle. I flipped to the 4th page and found exactly what I was looking for. The truth was about to make Preston Sterling very, very uncomfortable. According to the crash scene investigators, I read aloud, there were no skid marks prior to the point of impact. Furthermore, a diagnostic check of your vehicle's onboard computer system showed no brake deployment until post-collision. The brakes didn't fail, Mr. Sterling, you never used them. According to the crash scene investigators, I read aloud, there were no skid marks prior to the point of impact. Furthermore, a diagnostic check of your vehicle's onboard computer system showed no brake deployment until post-collision. The brakes didn't fail, Mr. Sterling. You never used them. The courtroom remained completely still. The evidence was irrefutable. It wasn't a sudden stop by the plaintiff. It wasn't a mechanical failure by the manufacturer. It was absolute, unadulterated negligence by a driver who was too distracted, too careless, or simply too entitled to pay attention to a red light. I looked at Preston. The defiance was draining out of him, replaced by a sullen pout. Well, he muttered, I might have been looking at my phone for a second, but like I said, my dad's insurance will cover it. It's not a big deal. That was the moment I realized this case wasn't just about a car crash. It was about a young man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. He viewed destruction as a transaction. He believed that any damage he caused could simply be billed to his father's accountant. He had no concept of the emotional toll, the financial strain, or the sheer disrespect he had inflicted on Mr. Miller. Mr. Sterling, I said, leaning forward. This is a court of law, not your personal concierge service. You do not get to determine what is or isn't a big deal when you destroy another person's property through reckless behavior. He crossed his arms, looking like a petulant child who had just been told he couldn't have a second piece of cake. I already said I'd pay for it. What more do you want? I want you to understand the gravity of your actions, I replied. But clearly, that is beyond your current capacity. Then, I turned my attention back to Mr. Miller's folder. There was one more piece of evidence, one more document that David had quietly submitted. It was a printed email exchange. I picked it up and began to read. It was an email from Preston to his friends, sent the morning after the accident. The subject line read, "Totaled the Beamer." I read the content silently, feeling a surge of genuine disgust. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "did you send an email to your friends the day after the collision bragging about the accident?" Preston's eyes darted around the room. He didn't answer immediately. He knew exactly what email I was holding, and he knew how bad it looked. I might have mentioned it to some guys," he mumbled. I didn't let him off the hook. I read the email aloud for the entire courtroom to hear. "I rear-ended some old guy's piece of trash truck last night. Totally smashed my front end. Dad's going to be pissed, but whatever. Time for an upgrade anyway. Lol." The sheer callousness of the message hung in the air. He hadn't just destroyed David's property. He had treated the entire incident as a joke, an opportunity to get a newer, better car funded by his father. There was zero remorse, zero empathy, zero accountability. I looked at David Miller. He sat quietly, his jaw clenched, enduring the disrespect with far more grace than Preston deserved. Then I looked back at Preston. "You consider destroying a man's livelihood and his hard work a joke, Mr. Sterling?" I asked. He looked down at his shoes, the smirk finally, completely gone. "No, Your Honor. No," I agreed. "It is not a joke, and neither is the judgment I am about to render." But before I could formally announce the judgment, the courtroom doors swung open again. It was the moment that would turn this routine property damage case into something truly unforgettable, because standing in the doorway was the one person Preston Sterling believed would always save him. His father, Richard Sterling, walked in, and the look on his face told me exactly why he was there. The courtroom remained perfectly still as Richard Sterling took his place at the podium next to his son. Preston looked at him, desperately searching for the familiar reassurance, the usual blank check that would make this entire problem vanish. But Richard's face was unreadable. He didn't look at Preston, he looked at me, then slowly turned his gaze toward David Miller. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice surprisingly calm. "I have spent my entire life building a business, a reputation, and a legacy. I believed I was providing for my family. What I failed to realize was that by providing everything, I taught my son the value of nothing." Preston's face flushed red. "Dad, stop. You don't have to do this here. Let's just settle this and go." Richard ignored him completely. "I received a phone call from Mr. Miller 3 days after the accident. He didn't ask for a handout. He didn't threaten to sue me. He simply asked if I was aware of how my son had behaved at the scene." I looked at David. He nodded slightly, maintaining his dignified silence. "Interesting. Very interesting. Because most people in David's position would have immediately contacted a lawyer to go after the deepest pockets available. David didn't. He appealed directly to the father, not for money, but for accountability." "And what did you do with that information, Mr. Sterling?" I asked. "I investigated," Richard replied. "I pulled the dashcam footage myself. I reviewed the police report. And then I found the emails Preston sent to his friends." Preston flinched. The realization that his father had seen the exact same vile message I had just read aloud finally cracked his arrogant facade. He wasn't just losing a case, he was losing his safety net. "Mr. Sterling," I said to Richard, "as a parent, your instinct is to protect your child. Many people in your position would have simply written a check to make this go away quietly." "I have written too many checks, Your Honor," Richard said, his voice heavy with regret. "Every time he made a mistake, I wrote a check. Every time he broke a rule, I made a call. I thought I was protecting him. But after reading that email, after seeing how he viewed Mr. Miller, a man who works with his hands to earn a living, I realized I hadn't protected him. I ruined him." The absolute silence in the courtroom was profound. You could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer just a hearing about property damage. It was a public reckoning. It was the collapse of privilege happening in real time. Richard turned to his son. "Preston, you are 21 years old. You live in a house you didn't buy, driving cars you didn't earn, spending money you didn't make. And you believe that makes you superior to a man who spent 4 years building something with his own 2 hands." "Dad, please," Preston whispered, the entitlement completely replaced by panic. "No," Richard said firmly, "I am done. The document I submitted to the court is a formal declaration. I am legally severing my financial responsibility for this incident. My insurance will not cover it. My accounts will not cover it. You broke it, Preston. You pay for it." The impact of those words was immediate. Preston gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. The smirk, the eye rolling, the heavy sighs, all of it vanished, replaced by the stark terror of a young man suddenly forced to face reality without a shield. "Your Honor," Richard said, turning back to me, "I ask that you enter judgment for the plaintiff, and I ask that you hold my son completely, personally liable for every single penny." The entire courtroom watched as the reality of the situation finally crashed down on Preston Sterling. The invincible armor of his family name, the endless bank accounts, the high-priced fixers, everything he had relied on his entire life had just been stripped away by the one man he thought would always protect him. Richard Sterling stood tall, a man who had clearly agonized over this decision, but knew it was the only way to save his son's character. "You will get a job, Preston," Richard said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You will figure out a payment plan with Mr. Miller, and if you default, he has my full blessing to garnish whatever wages you manage to earn. You are a legal adult, and today you will start acting like one." Preston was completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk that had infuriated everyone just 20 minutes earlier was entirely gone. In its place was the terrified expression of a child who had just realized the safety net had been permanently removed. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, as if expecting the court to somehow intervene and force his father to pay. But years on the bench teach you to recognize the exact moment a necessary, painful lesson takes root. "Mr. Sterling," I said, directing my attention back to Preston, "your father has given you a remarkable gift today. It doesn't feel like a gift right now, but accountability rarely does. You walked into this courtroom believing that your wealth made you immune to the rules of a civilized society. You treated Mr. Miller with profound disrespect, not just on the street, but right here in this room. You viewed his property and his livelihood as completely disposable. I picked up my pen and looked down at the final paperwork. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. The dashcam footage, the forensic report, and your own documented admissions prove your absolute negligence. Therefore, I am entering judgment in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. David Miller, in the full amount of $28,000. And let the record reflect that this judgment is entered against Preston Sterling personally. The heavy thud of my gavel finalized the ruling. Preston flinched at the sound. He lowered his head, burying his face in his hands, and that is when the tears finally came. Actual, genuine tears. He wasn't crying because he felt remorse for the accident. He was crying because, for the first time in his 21 years on Earth, he was entirely responsible for his own mess. As the gallery began to clear, David Miller quietly gathered his manila folder. Richard Sterling approached him once more, offering a firm, respectful handshake. "I am deeply sorry, Mr. Miller. My son will make this right." David nodded, a man of few words but immense dignity. Some cases stay with you, not because of the legal complexity, but because of the raw human truth they reveal. Power and money can buy many things, but they cannot buy character. And when privilege finally collides with reality, the truth is always the last thing standing. As the courtroom doors slowly closed behind them, the silence left in their wake was profound. The gallery remained seated for a long moment, processing what they had just witnessed. They hadn't just watched a legal dispute over a totaled vintage truck. They had watched the absolute, systematic dismantling of a young man's untouchable reality. Preston Sterling had walked into my courtroom believing that consequences were something that only happened to other people. He thought his name would protect him. It didn't. He believed that his father's wealth was a permanent shield against the rules of civilized society. He thought he could smirk, insult, and buy his way out of basic human decency. Instead, he left with a devastating financial burden that he would have to pay off by actually working for a living. He left with a public humiliation that no amount of money could erase. Years on the bench teach you that true character is rarely forged in comfort. It is forged in the fire of accountability. Richard Sterling knew that. By refusing to write that check, by standing in front of a judge and demanding that his own son face the music, he did the hardest thing a parent can do. That wasn't anger. That was a decision. He chose justice over blind loyalty. He chose to save his son's character rather than his son's ego. As for David Miller, he walked out exactly as he had walked in, with his head held high, his dignity completely intact, and the law firmly on his side. He didn't need a tailored suit or a trust fund to command respect. He simply needed the truth. And in a courtroom, the truth is the only currency that actually matters. Power is a fascinating thing. People who have it often believe it makes them invincible. They believe it allows them to rewrite the facts, ignore the rules, and trample over anyone who stands in their way. But power was never meant to be a shield. Justice doesn't care who your father is. It doesn't care what kind of car you drive, and it certainly doesn't care about the balance in your bank account. Character is what remains when power fails. And on that particular day, Preston Sterling discovered he had absolutely none. Next time you see someone abusing power, or someone hiding behind a name, remember this case. If you found this courtroom story as powerful as I did, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more incredible cases where privilege meets reality. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have done what Richard Sterling did if it were your son? Thank you for watching. And remember, no matter how untouchable someone thinks they are, the truth always has the final word.